And thank you too, so fabulously and so eloquently putting the case for climate justice.
When women are in charge.
Now, Archbishop Tutu has already metaphorically rapped me on the knuckles for omitting to mention that Mrs. Robinson was Ireland's first president. What I have also not told you is that Mrs. Robinson has spent the last few years running an extremely important organization called Realizing Rights, based in New York, which has championed human rights and human rights abuses wherever she finds them.
Yes.
Women's, most recently what's happening to the inmates in Guantanamo. So why is it that at this stage Mrs. Robinson is taking such a keen part in this Alliance for Climate Justice? Over to you, Mary Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nisha. Could I say I'm delighted to be back here in the University of Pretoria, which I have a nice connection with, as you heard, on this particular subject. And following the leadership of Kofi and Arch, another thing we three have in common is we are designated elders, and Arch is our irrepressible, beloved chair of the elders. And it is appropriate, maybe, as elders, that we really focus on the damage that is being done to our earth for all living creatures in it, and that we sound an alarm in the way that we're doing. But also what we're doing is, I believe, very important and is not being done enough. We're defining and looking at global warming and climate change in a very broad way. You heard Kofi talk about it as an all-encompassing threat. And I think what Arch has done is put such a human face on it. And if you do that, then your approach is different. It's not just a highly technical problem of seawalls and seeds that don't need as much water. It becomes a very human-centered, very challenging issue that some people in certain parts of the world, the industrialized world, over a long period of time, but intensively in recent decades, have chosen lifestyles that are damaging our climate because of greenhouse gas emissions. And those who haven't had those chances, who've had vulnerable situations of combating deep poverty and trying to reach the Millennium Goals, now are worse off and are deeply affected negatively by that global warming. Very often, based in the United States as I am, when I hear discussion about climate change and the need for green technologies, there's no discussion about causation. It's as if it was a natural phenomenon. But it's not a natural phenomenon. It is caused by human behavior. So we have to find principles of justice and equity to square that circle. And that's why I was so pleased that the Global Humanitarian Forum is giving leadership in saying we need these principles. And that's what we're focusing on here. There is also much more attention being paid by the wide human rights community to the effects of climate change. For example, there is a very good publication by the International Council on Human Rights Policy called Climate Change and Human Rights, a rough guide. And Oxfam, I'm very honoured to be honorary president of Oxfam, came out with a paper called Climate Wrongs and Human Rights, and setting out the human rights and the devastating impact on those human rights of climate change. Arch, you mentioned the small contribution of the continent of Africa. In fact, to be more precise, it's about 3.8%, I learned recently. I attended a conference in Rwanda in September, and the title of the conference was Climate Change, Adaptation, Development and Human Rights. It was opened by President Kagame. It was a conference co-organized by the government of Rwanda and the London School of Economics. And I learned, and you've put it more or less, that this whole continent is responsible for about 3.8% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that the 50 poorest countries around the world, many of them here in Africa, are responsible for 1%. And therefore, there really is an inequity in the situation, and we need to develop principles for dealing with climate change based on justice and equity. And that is what we have before us today. Frankly, Coffee, I want to strengthen those principles. I don't want them called guidelines, because I think if they're guidelines, people won't pay attention. I think we must call them principles for climate justice. And we need to be clear that we're drawing on existing commitments of governments under the international treaties and covenants, under the Rio Declaration. It was the Rio Declaration that is the basis for the first principle we're looking at there. Take responsibility for the pollution you cause, that the polluter should pay. And the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is also in the 1992 UN Framework Convention itself. And other principles can be drawn from the international covenants, including the Convention on Procedural Environmental Justice. So what I would hope is that we can have a dialogue, and actually I'm going to stop at this point because we need time to hear your views. Not only do we have this great audience here, but I know that there are actually hundreds of thousands of people who are linking in with this discussion on the internet. We heard this morning that some of them had already put some of their questions, but I understand from Nisha you're probably going to get priority. But let's focus a little bit on the 8 principles of climate justice, and know that some of them link more directly to justice because human rights are violated, others are matters of equity. For example, I would say that Principle 3, share benefits and burdens, I would add share benefits and burdens equitably, so that we bring in that notion of equity, not just sharing, but sharing equitably. And I think I'll stop at this point and invite questions and discussion, because we really want to bring this further, as you've heard, over the next period. In June, they'll be formally launched. For 6 months, we want to make these part of a wide movement involving all of the civil society organisations and hopefully others, until we can really influence the discussions in Copenhagen and beyond. Thank you. Sorry, one other point, because Arch also mentioned it. We have taken into account that, as you rightly said, it does bear more on women. They are already, we know about the feminisation of poverty, the way that women have to cope in so many contexts. So under Principle 5, reduce risks to a minimum, you'll see there, women are also particularly exposed to climate change-related risks due to the pre-existing gender discrimination, inequality, and inhibiting gender roles. So it's built in, we could strengthen it, but it's there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Robinson.